This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. With world hunger on the rise amidst the devastating social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, we continue to look at concerns that the United Nations' first Food Systems Summit underway today is giving corporations an outsized role framing its agenda. The summit is led by the former Rwandan agricultural minister, Agnes Kalibata, now president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA, which critics say promotes industrial agriculture over more sustainable farming. For more, we bring into this conversation Miljan Bilay in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the general coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. Also with us in Goa, India, is Shamali Gutel, executive director of Focus on the Global South. Still with us in Austin, Texas, Professor Raj Patel, who serves on the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, author of Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World's Food System. Nermeen?
Miljan Bilay, could you begin by give us more background on Dr. Agnes Kalibata and her record, the record of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, of which she's the head, and why you think she was appointed the UN Special Envoy for this food summit?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thanks for the lovely music. And I love Gigi quite a lot. I think I would love to focus on the institution rather than on the individual. Maybe they have selected her because she's a woman, she's a black woman, she's an African woman, as a form of representing this as a global agenda. Maybe, in terms of image, she fits that bill. But the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa has 13 board members, 13, and 8 of them are outside from outside Africa, and it's registered in the U.S. And Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, some companies are in the board of AGRA. So this is an outside control institution. And this shows that the corporate world wanted to control this event. It's very sad because discussion around the food system is very much critical, because there is a health crisis, there is a nutrition crisis, hunger crisis, environmental crisis, cultural crisis, and human rights crisis. We're in a crisis, and the majority of this crisis is because of the food system that we have. So we need transition, the right kind of transition. Therefore, the institution that she represents, even if the name says the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. We know what Green Revolution has done in India. And Shamali can tell us about that. It has destroyed people's life, people's culture, seed, the environment, and has created, a huge burden of disease. And malnutrition is still there. And as Raj said, it has failed in Africa. It has been tried for 13 years, and it has failed. Now we have seen the recommendation from Africa for the UNFSS for transition. It's all about green ecology, green revolution. So yeah, this is very sad. It's a wasted chance, I would like to say.
So, Shamali Gutel, you're in Goa, India. As you look at the Food Systems Summit from there, this segment is larger than the Food Systems Summit. It's about the growing hunger in the world. But can you talk about that approach? You've been a fierce critic. You've been tweeting a lot about what's happening and how it's determining what's happening in the world and what you see needs to happen.
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly.
Okay. Well, yes, there is growing hunger in the world, and there is growing inequality and growing poverty and unemployment. And all this is not because there isn't enough food being produced in the world. A majority of the world's food is produced by, small-scale food producers who are producing this food on just about a quarter of the world's territories. 80% of the world's territories and resources are actually captured by larger businesses and corporations. And there's a lot of food procurement, production, provision that goes undocumented. But when we talk about the crises in the food systems, it's really interesting that the mainstream discourse isn't looking at the crisis of the global food system, which is the industrialized, corporate-controlled food system, which has been responsible, for many of the multiple crises that we're facing now, with the hunger, the unemployment, the malnutrition, the climate change crisis, the industrial contamination, and so on. So, in the last 10 to 15 years, with crisis after crisis coming out, and the food price crisis more than 10 years ago, and the financial crisis, which was also there in 2009, 2010, since then it's become really increasingly clear to the world's people that this industrialized, globalized, corporate-led food system is failing us. It has failed. It's not going to do anything better. And to keep pouring, money into it and resources into it is dangerous. But how, unfortunately, or rather maybe this has been the design, so it's not a question of luck or fortune, more and more privatization has been happening across the South. It was already happening in the North countries. It's been happening more and more in the South, including key aspects of food provision. Now, food has a tremendous public purpose. The right to food is dependent on the realization of numerous other rights. Similarly, the violation of other rights, also affects the right to food. And food, as a holistic, how we say, it's not a thing. It's a whole dimension in and of itself. Control over the different aspects of food are extremely important for those who want to continue to make profits. And this has been one of the big tragedies of privatization and liberalization and deregulation and then re-regulation for corporations that we have seen over the last 15 or 20 years. And, the COVID-19 pandemic showed who feeds the world, who looked after the world. It wasn't the industrialized, globalized food system. It were local producers, it was food sovereignty movements, it was unions, it was mutual help groups, community kitchens, community shared agriculture and fisheries. This is what helped. This is what fed the world during COVID. And, the way we see it, my own organization and the group that we're very closely aligned with in the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, and we have a larger group of social movements called the Liaison Group of the Autonomous Peoples' Response to the UN Food System Summit. For us, it's very clear that this Food System Summit has been deliberately designed and pushed forward the way it is to allow corporations to secure control, not only over food and food systems, but equally important over the governance of food systems. And that's a very important issue, which I hope I'll be able to speak further on in this program. Why don't I stop here for the moment?
Well, Sharmili, as Milian mentioned, one of the examples that's touted most in favor of industrial agriculture is, of course, the experience of the Green Revolution in India. This was first introduced in 1965, and its advocates say led substantially to a reduction in hunger as well as malnutrition. Could you explain why you're critical of this approach and what's happened in recent decades following its initial purported success?
Well, yes, initially the Green Revolution did boost production. And there was, there were, overflowing granaries. And yes, it did indeed address the hunger or lack of food problem at that time. But what it also did was introduce and convert Indian agriculture into chemically intensive monocultures. And these chemically intensive monocultures, initially they may have come, through public subsidies and supports. I mean, the inputs and the inputs for those production. But over the decades, as those supports and subsidies started to dry out, small-scale farmers, family farmers, even middle-scale, a middle-scale farmer in India would be, I think in hectares, not in acres, so it would be, 3 to 4 hectares would be a small-scale farmer. A middle-scale farmer would be, say, at maximum 10 to 15 hectares. They started finding themselves in increased debt traps. Because one of the things that happened with intensive use of chemicals is your soil gets contaminated and it will not keep producing. And in order to make your soil produce and make your farms produce, you're going to pump more and more chemicals into it. And it's a vicious cycle of destruction of the very territory from which you would grow your food. And so what we saw, that destruction triggered the environmental and a crisis of production, but attendant to that, a tremendous social crisis. So farmers who were not able to meet their debt payments for the inputs that they had purchased, when their seeds failed, they had to buy more seeds, so they got more into debt. They put their land into mortgage, and we saw a distress migration of people away from the rural areas into the urban areas. And so more and more hands that were producing the food left the land, and they left that kind of production and started moving into other types of production. Now, many of them stayed in the food world. I mean, as Raj said earlier, the hands that touch our food. Most of the hands that touch our food do come from food-producing families. But they're doing different jobs now. They're working in construction labor or delivery or food vending, local vending. But and this is not a case only in India. This is a case throughout Asia. We're going through a very severe agrarian crisis across Asia, where industrialized, monoculture-oriented, chemically intensive agriculture has created economic and social crises. So in India, for example, I think the world is very familiar with the farmer suicides that have happened in India. These suicides are the highest where farmer debt is the highest, and farmer debt is the highest, of course, where farmers have been forced to borrow for seeds, for equipment, for chemicals. And we must also see this side by side with the other crisis that India was going through, and which the inability and the failure of the Indian state to ensure strong social protection systems. Because one may be in debt, a family may be in debt, and be using all its, using whatever income that it has to pay off its debt. But if you don't have good public health systems, if you don't have good social security and social protection system, you don't have a decent education system, you don't have transportation, clean water. If all these are either being disinvested by the public exchequer and or being privatized, most rural communities in India and in many parts of Asia are one major illness away from complete ruin, because they will have to pay huge healthcare bills if they want to get any decent healthcare. So these are processes that are going together. The Green Revolution at one hand, and the social and economic crisis, and then which were closely related to the environmental contamination and crisis it created, accompanied by a absence and then of sufficient public investment going to social important key social and even financial sectors.
We only have a few more minutes to go at this moment, but we are going to continue this discussion, of course, on Democracy Now! But I wanted to go back to Miljan Bilay, who is in the capital of Ethiopia, in Addis. If you could talk about why you see it's critical to frame the hunger issue in a human rights framework, and what that would mean. What has to happen now? Use the example of your own country, Ethiopia, Miljan.
Yeah, I think the responsibility of feeding the people is from government. Government are responsible to feed the people. For that, they have to have the right policy, the right kind of agricultural policy. If you follow the Green Revolution agenda and put farmers in debt and contaminate the soil, and also, in terms of productivity and also the diversity of the seeds, there's an increased diversity. Through time, you are putting your population, the farmer population, which is over 80% in Ethiopia, into unsustainability. You are trapping them into the future, which is not sustainable at all. So they have to have the right to choose what kind of agriculture they want. They have the right to choose what kind of seed that they want to plant. And the kind of, it has broken the social fabric of the society somehow, the kind of agriculture that's happening. And it has even damaged the relationship between the government and the people, because the government has to force the people to accept high-yielding varieties and artificial fertilizers and pesticides and a certain way of farming and reorienting the whole agriculture into market. All that puts people into a situation where they will be much more poorer than before. So they are not getting better. And it's a responsibility of the government that, to keep the country and the people in the path of sustainability, not in the path of dependence. And when people have a problem because of the environment and social and political and whatever, it's a government's responsibility to provide food, to make food accessible, to ensure that food is healthy and nutritious, and to ensure that food is culturally appropriate, and to protect them from the vagaries of trade. So that's what we mean by the right to food and the human rights at the center of food production. And we feel that agroecology ticks all that. It produces more food, healthy food, nutritious food, without impacting the environment, even improving the environment, and culturally appropriate food. And the right to food is at the center of agroecology. That's what we want to promote.
Well, Raj Patel, we'd like to end with you. One of the striking things that you point out in your Scientific American article, Agroecology is the Solution to World Hunger, which is what Milion was saying as well, is that over the past decade, food production has outstripped demand. There's more food per person than there ever was. And the problem with food distribution is not so much its quantity, but the fact that it's distributed in an unequal way. Could you explain how the practice of agroecology, which you've witnessed yourself in Malawi and elsewhere, how this practice could also ensure more equitable access and distribution?
Thank you so much. I mean, very briefly, agroecology is a science, it's a set of practices, and it is a social movement to be able to transform the way that we not just grow food, but regulate it and share it and make sure that everyone has it, and that it exists within the broader economy that Shalmali Milion were talking about just now. Agroecology is a way not only of identifying that there are amazing synergies between different kinds of crops that don't rely on the industrial, chemical-intensive agriculture that Shalmali was talking about, but also that we need social synergies. We need ways of recognizing and supporting food production around the world in ways that redirect subsidies away from chemically intensive agriculture and the health subsidies and the environmental costs of industrial agriculture, and instead aims big. And that means really, the heart of agroecology is a leveling of inequalities in power. Hunger today is gendered. 10% more women around the world are hungry than men. We see obviously inequalities in hunger in terms of race globally, in terms of colonialism and its histories. But if we are to be serious about taking agroecology to scale, we have to tackle inequalities in power. And I think that's one of the worries about this Food System Summit, is that it is concentrating power in governance mechanisms that are they're entirely unaccountable. And what agroecology offers is a circular and solidarity economy that is absolutely about sort of leveling inequalities in power so that we not only are able to coax more from the soil, but also return more to it and make sure that everyone gets to eat healthily.